bees when the phone rang and Gatsby took up the receiver. Yes. Well, I can't talk now. I can't talk now. Old sport. Well, he's no use to us if Detroit is his idea of a small town. He rang off. Come here, Q-U-I-C-K, cried Daisy at the window. The rain was still falling, but the darkness had parted in the west. And there was a pink and golden billow of foamy clouds above the sea. Look at that, she whispered. And then, after a moment, I'd like to just get one of those pink clouds and put you in it and push you around. I tried to go then, but they wouldn't hear of it. Perhaps my presence made them feel more satisfactorily alone. I know what we'll do, said Gatsby. We'll have Clip Springer play the piano. Slightly worn young man with show-minus rimmed glasses and scanty blonde hair. He was now decently clothed in a sport shirt open at the neck, sneakers and duck trousers of a nebulous hue. Did we interrupt your exercises? Inquired Daisy politely. I was asleep, cried Mr. Clipspringer, in a spasm of embarrassment. That is, I'd be asleep. Then I got up. Clipspringer plays the piano, said Gatsby, cutting him off. Don't you, Ewing? Old sport. I don't play well. I don't minus. I hardly play at all. I'm all out of prac minus. We'll go downstairs, interrupted Gatsby. He flipped a switch. The grey windows disappeared as the house glowed full of light. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match and sat down with her on a couch far across the room, where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. I'm all out of practice, you see. I told you I couldn't play. I'm all out of prac minus. Don't talk so much. Old sport. Commanded Gatsby. Play. INTHEMO RNING INTHEEVNINGO AINTWEGOT FU and minus. Outside the wind was loudened. There was a faint flow of thunder along the sound. All the lights were going on in West Egg now. The electric trains. Men minus Carrie were plunging home through the rain from New York. It was the hour of a profound human change, and excitement was generating on the air. RNETH, INGS, SERERENDNOTH, SSURERTHE, ETRCHEO, ARO, INDTHEPORGET minus, CHILDREN, INTHEME by NTIME, INDETWE minus as I went over to say goodbye. I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face. As though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. Almost 5 years. There must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams minus, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart. As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be over minus dreamed minus. That voice was a deathless song. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. Remotely, possessed by intense life. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. Chapter 6. About this time, an ambitious young reporter from New York arrived one morning at Gatsby's door and asked him if he had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby politely. Why, minus any statement to give out. It transpired after a confused 5 minutes that the man had heard Gatsby's name around his office in a connection which he either wouldn't reveal or didn't fully understand. This was his day off, and with laudable initiative he had hurried out to see. It was a random shot, and yet the reporter's instinct was right. Gatsby's notoriety spread about by the hundreds who had accepted his hospitality and so become authorities on his past, had increased all summer until he fell just short of being news. Contemporary legends, such as the underground pipe minus line to Canada, attached themselves to him, and there was one persistent story that he didn't live in a house at all, but in a boat like a house, and was moved secretly up and down the Long Island shore. Just why these inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. Gatz minus that was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it at the age of 17, and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career minus. When his yacht dropped anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior, it was James Gatz, who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of Congas pants. Pulled out to the TUOLOME and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people minus his imagination had never really accepted them. The truth was that Great Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God minus a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that minus, and he must be about his father's business. Service. And to this conception he was faithful to the end. For over a year he had been beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and bed. His brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half-fierce, half-lazy work of the bracing days. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them. Of young virgins because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-minus absorption he took for granted. A universe of ineffable gaudy nests spun itself out in his brain, while the clock ticked on the wash-midas stand, and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies, until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. For a while, these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing, an instinct toward his future glory had led him, some months before, to the small Lutheran college of St. Olaf in southern Minnesota. He stayed there 2 weeks, dismayed at its ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny, to destiny itself, and despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. Then he drifted back to Lake Superior, and he was still searching for something to do on the day that Don Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows alongshore. Cody was 50 years old then, a product of the Nevada silver fields. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust, but on the verge of soft-mindedness. And suspecting this, an infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. The none too savory ramifications by which Elike The newspaper woman played Madame de Maintenon to his weakness and sent him to sea in a yacht. Or common knowledge to the turgid journalism of 1902. He had been coasting along all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up as James Gatsby's destiny at Little Girl Bay. To the young Gats, resting on his oars and looking up at the railed deck, the yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. I suppose he smiled at Cody minus. He had probably discovered that people liked him when he smiled. At any rate, Cody asked him a few questions. One of them elicited the brand new name and found that he was quick. And extravagantly ambitious. A few days later, he took him to Duluth, then bought him a blue coat, 6 pair of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap. And when the TUOLO, he left for the West Indies, and the Barbary Coast Gatsby left too. He was employed in a vague personal capacity minus. While he remained with Cody, he was in turn steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailor, for down Cody sober knew what lavish doings and Cody drunk might soon be about, and he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. The arrangement lasted 5 years, during which the boat went 3 times around the continent. I remember the portrait of him up in Gatsby's bedroom. A grey, florid man with a hard, empty face minus. The pioneer debooking one phase of American life, brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. It was indirectly due to Cody that Gatsby drank so little. Sometimes in the course of gay parties, women used to rub champagne into his hair for himself. He formed the habit of letting liquor alone. And it was from Cody that he inherited money minus a legacy of $5,000. He didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him. But what remained of the millions went intact to Ellicay. He was left with his singularly appropriate education. The vague contour of Jagos be it filled out to the substantiality of a man. He told me all this very much later, but I've put it down here with the idea of exploding those first wild rumors about his antecedents, which weren't even faintly true. Moreover, he told it to me at a time of confusion. So to speak, caught his breath to clear the set of misconceptions away. It was a halt, too, in my association with his affairs. For several weeks, I didn't see him or hear his voice on the phone minus. Mostly I was in New York, trotting around with Jordan and trying to ingratiate myself with her senile aunt minus. But finally, I went over to his house one Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there 2 minutes when somebody brought Tom Buchanan in for a drink. I was startled, naturally, But the really surprising thing was that it hadn't happened before. There were a party of 3 on horseback, minus and a man named Sloane, and a pretty woman in a brown riding habit who had been there previously. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby, standing on his porch. "I'm delighted that you dropped in," as though they cared. "Sit right down. Have a cigarette or a cigar?" He walked around the room quickly. "Ringing bells. I'll have something to drink for you in just a minute." He was profoundly affected by the fact that Tom was there. Realizing in a vague way that that was all they came for. Mr. Sloane wanted nothing. A lemonade? No, thanks. A little champagne? I'm sorry, minus. Did you have a nice ride? Very good roads around here. I suppose the automobiles minus, yeah. Moved by an irresistible impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom, who had accepted the introduction as a stranger. "I believe we've met somewhere before, Mr. Buchanan." "Oh. Yes," said Tom, gruffly polite, but obviously not remembering. "So we did. I remember very well. About 2 weeks ago." "That's right. You were with Nick here." "I know your wife," continued Gatsby, almost aggressively. "That so?" Tom turned to me. "You live near here, Nick?" "Next door." "That so, mister?" Sloane didn't enter into the conversation, but lounged back haughtily in his chair. The woman said nothing, either minus, until, unexpectedly, "Mr. Gatsby," she suggested. "What do you say?" "Certainly. I'd be delighted to have you." "Beverness," said Mr. Sloane, without gratitude. "Well, minus think ought to be starting home." "Please don't hurry," Gatsby urged them. He had control of himself now, and he wanted to see more of Tom. Why don't you stay for supper? I wouldn't be surprised if some other people dropped in from New York." "You come to supper with me," said the lady enthusiastically. "Both of you." This included me. Mr. Sloane got to his feet. "Come along," he said, minus, but to her only. "I mean it," she insisted. "I'd love to have you. Lots of room." Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloane had determined he shouldn't. "I'm afraid I won't be able to, I said. She urged, concentrating on Gatsby. Mr. Sloane murmured something close to her ear. We won't be late if we start now, she insisted aloud. I haven't got a horse, said Gatsby. I used to ride in the army, but I've never bought a horse. The rest of us walked out on the porch, where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. My God, I believe the man's coming, said Dom. Doesn't he know she doesn't want him? She says she does want him. She has a big dinner party, and he won't know a soul there. He frowned. I wonder where in the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish. Suddenly Mr. Sloane and the lady walked down the steps and mounted their horses. Come on, said Mr. Sloane, to town. We're late. We've got to go. And then to me, tell him we couldn't wait, will you? Tom and I shook hands. The rest of us exchanged a cool nod and they trotted quickly down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage, just as Gatsby, with hat and light overcoat in hand, came out the front door. Tom was evidently perturbed at Daisy's running around alone, for on the following Saturday night, he came with her to Gatsby's party. Perhaps his presence gave the evening its peculiar quality of oppressiveness minus. It stands out in my memory from Gatsby's other parties that summer. There were the same people, or at least the same sort of people. Many minus skied commotion, but I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I had merely grown used to it, grown to accept West Egg as a world complete in itself, with its own standards and its own great figures, second to nothing because it had no consciousness of being so. And now I was looking at it again, through Daisy's eyes. It is invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things upon which you have expended your own powers of adjustment. They arrived at twilight, and as we strolled out, among the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing Murmur, O you asterisks, in her throat. These things excite me also, she whispered. If you want to kiss me any time during the evening, Nick, just let me know, and I'd be glad to arrange it for you. Just mention my name, or present a green card. I'm giving out green minus, look around, suggested Gatsby. I'm looking around. I'm having a marvelous minus. You must see the faces of many people you've heard about, he said, In fact, I was just thinking I don't know a soul here. Perhaps you know that lady. Gatsby indicated a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white plum tree. Tom and Daisy stared with the peculiarly unreal feeling that accompanies the recognition of a hitherto ghostly celebrity of the movies. "She's lovely," said Daisy. "The man bending over her is her director." He took them ceremoniously from group to group, Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan minus, after an instant's hesitation he added it. "The polo player." "Oh no," objected Tom quickly, "not me." "I've never met so many celebrities," Daisy exclaimed. Gatsby identified him, adding that he was a small producer. "Well, I liked him anyhow. I'd a little rather not be the polo player," said Tom pleasantly. "I'd rather look at all these famous people in minus in oblivion." Daisy and Gatsby danced. I remember being surprised by his graceful, conservative fox strut minus. I had never seen him dance before. Then they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour, while at her request I remained watchfully in the garden. Tom appeared from his oblivion as we were sitting down to supper together. "Do you mind if I eat with some people over here?" he said. "I fellows getting off some funny stuff." "Go ahead," answered Daisy genially. "And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil." She looked around after a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty. And I knew that except for the half hour she'd been alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. We were at a particularly tipsy table. That was my fault. Minus Gatsby had been called to the phone, and I'd enjoyed these same people only 2 weeks before. But what had amused me then turned septic on the air now. "How do you feel, Miss Baedeker?" The girl addressed was trying, unsuccessfully, to slump against my shoulder. At this inquiry, she sat up and opened her eyes. "WHA. A massive and lethargic woman who had been urging Daisy to play golf with her at the local club tomorrow. Spoke in Miss Baedeker's defense, so she's all right now. When she's had 5 or 6 cocktails, she always starts screaming like that. I tell her she ought to leave it alone." "I do leave it alone," affirmed the accused hollow lie. "We heard you yelling." So I said to Doc Civet here, there's somebody that needs your help, Doc. She's much obliged. I'm sure, said another friend. Without gratitude. But you got her dress all wet when you stuck her head in the pool. Anything I hate is to get my head stuck in a pool, mumbled Miss Baedeker. They almost drowned me once over in New Jersey. Then you ought to leave it alone, countered Dr. Civet. Speak for yourself, cried Miss Baedeker violently. Your hand shakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching except for a pale thin ray of moonlight between. I like her, said Daisy. I think she's lovely. But the rest defended her and inarguably. Because it wasn't a gesture but an emotion. She was appalled by West Egg. This unprecedented place that Broadway had begot in upon a Long Island fishing village minus. Appalled by its revigor that chafed under the old euphemisms and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing. I sat on the front steps with them while they waited for their car. It was dark here in front, only the bright door sent 10 square feet of light volleying out into the soft black morning. Sometimes a shadow moved against a dressing room blind above, gave way to another shadow, an indefinite procession of shadows. Demanded Tom suddenly. Some big bootlegger? Where'd you hear that? I inquired. I didn't hear it. I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers. You know, not Gatsby, I said shortly. He was silent for a moment. A breeze stirred the grey haze of daisies for color. She said with an effort, "You didn't look so interested." Well, I was. Tom laughed and turned to me. Did you notice Daisy's face when that girl asked her to put her under a cold shower? Daisy began to sing with the music in a husky, rhythmic whisper, bringing out a meaning in each word that it had never had before and would never have again. When the melody rose, her voice broke up sweetly, following it. In a way contralto voices have, and each changed to doubt a little of her warm human magic upon the air. Lots of people come who haven't been invited, she said suddenly. That girl hadn't been invited. They simply force their way in, and he's too polite to object. I'd like to know who he is and what he does, insisted Tom. and I think I'll make a point of finding out. I can tell you right now." She answered, "He owned some drugstores, a lot of drugstores. He built them up himself." The dilatory limousine came rolling up the drive. "Good night, Nick," said Daisy. Her glance left me and sought the lighted top of the steps where 3 o'clock in the morning. A neat, sad little waltz of that year was drifting out the open door. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party, there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, incalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rad to be marveled at. Some authentically radiant young girl who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up. Chilled and exalted from the black beach until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. When he came down the steps at last, the tan skin was drawn unusually tight on his face, and his eyes were bright and tired. She didn't like it. He said immediately. Of course she did. She didn't like it. He insisted. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. "I feel far away from her," he said. "It's hard to make her understand." "You mean about the dance? The dance?" He dismissed all the dances he had given with a snap of his fingers. "I never loved you." After she had obliterated 3 years, with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. See you. We'd sit for hours minus. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desert path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. "I wouldn't ask too much of her," I ventured. "You can't repeat the past." "Can't repeat the past?" He cried incredulously. "Why, of course you can." Just out of reach of his hand. "I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before," he said. Not indeterminately. "She'll see." He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something. Some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling. And they came to a place. Now, it was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in it, which comes at the touches of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees, minus he could climb to it. If he climbed alone. And once there he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. His mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch she blossomed for him, like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Through all he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something minus an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth and my lips parted, like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound. What I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. Chapter 7, it was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in his house failed to go on one Saturday night minusant. Only gradually did I become aware that the automobiles which turned expectantly into his drive stayed for just a minute and then drove sulkily away. Is Mr. Gatsby sick? Nope. After a pause he added sir in a dilatory, "Quashing weight. I hadn't seen him around, and I was rather worried. Tell him Mr. Carraway came over." "Who?" he demanded rudely. My Finn informed me that Gatsby had dismissed every servant in his house a week ago and replaced them with half a dozen others, who never went into West Egg Village to be bribed by the tradesmen, but ordered moderate supplies over the telephone. The grocery boy reported that the kitchen looked like a pigsty. Next day, Gatsby called me on the phone. Going away? I inquired. "No, old sport. I hear you fired all your servants." I wanted somebody who wouldn't gossip. Daisy comes over quite often minus in the afternoons, so the whole caravanserai had fallen in like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. There's some people Wolf Sheehan wanted to do something for. They're all brothers and sisters. They used to run a small hotel. I see. He was calling up at Daisy's request minus would I come to lunch at her house tomorrow. Miss Baker would be there. Half an hour later, Daisy herself telephoned and seemed relieved to find that I was coming. Something was up, and yet I couldn't believe that they would choose this occasion for a C minor, especially for the rather harrowing scene that Gatsby had outlined in the garden. The next day was broiling, almost the last, certainly the warmest, of the summer, as my train emerged from the tunnel into sunlight. Only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. Trust. And then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into deep heat with a desolate cry. Her pocket minus book slapped to the floor. Oh my, she gasped. I picked it up with a weary bend and handed it back to her, holding it at arm's length and by the extreme tip of the corners to indicate that I had no designs upon it minus. But everyone nearby, including the woman, suspected me just the same. Hot, said the conductor to familiar faces. Some weather. My commutation ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. That anyone should care in this heat whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the telephone bell out to Gatsby and me as we waited at the door. The master's body, roared the butler into the mouthpiece. I'm sorry, madame, but we can't furnish it minus. It's far too hot to touch this noon. Listening slightly to take our stiff straw hats. Madam, he expects you in the salon, he cried, needlessly indicating the direction. In this heat, every extra gesture was an affront to the common store of life. The room, shadowed well with awnings, was dark and cool. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch, like silver idols, weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. We can't move, they said together. Jordan's fingers, powdered white over their tan, rested for a moment in mine. And Miss Buchanan, the athlete, I inquired. Simultaneously, I heard his voice. Gruff, muffled, husky, at the whole telephone. Gatsby stood in the center of the crimson carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed. Her sweet, exciting, laugh, a tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. The rumor is, whispered Jordan, that that's Dom's girl on the telephone. We were silent. The voice in the hall rose high with annoyance. Very well then, I won't sell you the car at all. I'm under no obligations to you at all. And as for your bothering me about it, at lunchtime I won't stand. That at all? Holding down the receiver, said Daisy cynically. No. He's not, I assured her. It's a bona fide deal. I happen to know about it. Tom flung open the door, blocked out its space for a moment with his thick body, and hurried into the room. Mr. Gatsby, he put out his broad, flat hand with well minus concealed dislike. Sir, Nick, make us a cold drink, cried Daisy. As he left the room, again she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. You know I love you, she murmured. You forget there's a lady present, said Jordan. Daisy looked around alphily. You kiss Nick too. What a low, vulgar girl. I don't care, cried Daisy, and began to clog on the brick fireplace. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch just as a freshly laundered nurse, leading a little girl, came into the room. Bless mine sis, ed pre minus sias, she crooned, holding out her arms. Come to your own mother that loves you. The child, relinquished by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. The bless minus is ed pre minus sias. Did mother get powder on your old yellow wire? Stand up now and say how minus deminused you. Gatsby and I, in turn, leaned down and took the small, reluctant hand. Afterward, he kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever really believed in its existence before. I got dressed before luncheon, said the child, turning eagerly to Daisy.